A grand banquet was set. Red carpets rolled out. Xi Jinping smiled, shaking hands with Southeast Asian leaders. On paper, dozens of partnership agreements were signed. But within hours of his departure, the knives came out. Vietnam moved closer to Washington, striking a deal to purchase F-16 fighter jets. Malaysia quietly negotiated to snatch Boeing orders that China might cancel. Cambodia opened its Chinese-funded naval base to Japanese warships. A silent front was forming, an exodus unfolding quietly from China's shadow. What triggered this sudden defection, not from enemies but from longtime friends Beijing had nurtured for years? And more urgently, can Xi Jinping still contain the cracks before they explode into a global realignment that he can no longer control? It started with smiles, waves of red carpets, ceremonial parades, silk banners, state dinners under crystal chandeliers. From April 14th to 18th, Xi Jinping staged a grand tour across Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia, 3 nations he hoped to pull tightly into Beijing's orbit. Dozens of agreements were signed. News outlets hailed the trip as a diplomatic triumph. But behind the polished photos, reality was already falling apart. In Vietnam, Xi signed 45 cooperation agreements. On the surface, it looked impressive. But when you looked closer, it was China giving everything and Vietnam giving almost nothing back. Railway projects? Funded by Chinese loans. AI technology transfers? Offered freely by Chinese firms. Preferential trade access? Missing. Not a single major Vietnamese concession was made. No binding pledges. No trade-off in loyalty. And just 3 days after Xi left Hanoi, Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh met with Jeffrey Perlman, chairman of the U.S.-ASEAN Business Council. In front of cameras, he called the U.S.-Vietnam relationship special, unlike any other. If that wasn't a message, what was? But Vietnam didn't stop at words. According to 1945 military, Vietnam is preparing to buy at least 24 F-16 fighter jets from the United States. The biggest arms deal between the two countries since Washington lifted its arms embargo on Hanoi in 2016. For Xi, it was a diplomatic nightmare unfolding in slow motion. And it wasn't just Vietnam. In Malaysia, the smiles were even wider and even more hollow. Just a day after Xi's departure, news leaked, Malaysia Aviation Group was in talks with Boeing. If Chinese airlines canceled their Boeing 737 MAX orders due to trade tensions, Malaysia Airlines stood ready to pick them up. This wasn't just about business. It was a calculated move. A lifeline to an American company at China's expense. A clear signal Malaysia was hedging, and it wasn't hedging toward Beijing. And the blow didn't end there. Even Cambodia, long considered a near vassal of China, delivered a stinging message. After pouring billions into renovating Cambodia's GHIM naval base, after gifting 2 warships and holding a grand opening ceremony, Beijing expected loyalty. Instead, just 1 day after Xi's plane left, 2 Japanese warships sailed into the very same base. Cambodia held an official welcoming ceremony for them. The symbolism was devastating. Opening a Chinese-built, Chinese-funded military base to one of China's chief maritime rivals. In the Indo-Pacific, U.S. warships are China's enemy number 1. Japan's maritime self-defense force ranks number 2. And yet here Cambodia was hosting them, celebrating them, under Beijing's nose. The illusion of Chinese dominance was crumbling faster than anyone inside Zongnanhai had anticipated. From Vietnam to Malaysia to Cambodia, a pattern was emerging. No one was willing to openly confront Beijing, but no one was willing to bet their future on China either. Deals were signed, but hearts were elsewhere. Ceremonies were staged, but commitments were hollow. Beneath the glossy surface, Southeast Asia was quietly slipping out of China's grasp. And Xi Jinping, master of pageantry, architect of Belt and Road, was finding out. Too late. That charm campaigns can't fix a collapsing foundation. The facade was cracking. The dominoes were starting to fall. And the countries Beijing thought it had locked in were already looking for exits. They didn't shout it from the rooftops. They didn't issue bold declarations. They simply moved, step by step, country by country. Southeast Asia began to pivot, not with grand speeches, but with quiet, calculated actions. Singapore was the first whisper. Ho Ching, former First Lady, former CEO of Temasek Holdings, a heavyweight in both Singaporean and Chinese circles, reposted an article likening Xi Jinping to a mafia boss. The headline was brutal. If Xi Jinping hadn't spent the last 12 years acting like a mob boss, China would have much greater influence in the world today. Ho Ching wasn't just an average citizen. For nearly 2 decades, she controlled one of Singapore's most powerful financial arms. She still chairs major trusts and advises top Chinese universities. When someone like her turns and does so publicly, it sends a message that echoes far beyond Facebook posts. And Singapore wasn't acting alone. Singapore had quietly become one of China's biggest backdoors for banned semiconductor technology. Almost 98% of China's illegal semiconductor imports were routed through Singapore. But now, with Washington tightening sanctions, Singapore was shifting. No announcements. No headlines. Just quiet compliance. Tightening inspections. Slowing shipments. Choking off a critical Chinese lifeline without firing a single shot. Meanwhile, South Korea was tightening its own noose. In Q1 2025 alone, Korean customs uncovered $21 million worth of Chinese goods falsely labeled as Korean exports, almost matching the entire total for all of 2024. 90% of it was destined for the US market. This wasn't just random fraud. It was a strategy. China trying to slip through America's tariff walls by hijacking Korean trade routes. But Seoul wasn't playing along. Despite the relatively small dollar amount compared to its $130 billion annual exports to the US, South Korea cracked down hard. Why? Because risking Washington's trust wasn't worth any short-term Chinese profit. Even Thailand was stepping in. Authorities there uncovered 42 different product lines fraudulently claiming Thai origin, with most violations involving aluminum films and electric bicycles heading to the US and Europe. And Vietnam wasn't far behind. Its Ministry of Industry and Trade issued a directive explicitly targeting illegal transshipments of Chinese goods. Even Cambodia, often labeled Beijing's satellite, began drafting new regulations to stop being used as a transit point. Malaysia repeatedly warned Chinese firms not to use its ports for sneaking goods into American markets. Everywhere you looked, the same pattern was unfolding. Inspection rates rising, customs audits tightening, cooperation with U.S. trade authorities increasing. Without signing a single formal alliance, without forming a single official bloc, Southeast Asia was building an invisible wall against China. One inspection, one shipment, one quiet betrayal at a time. For Xi Jinping, it was a strategic disaster wrapped in polite smiles. He had hoped to rally a united front against American pressure. Instead, he triggered a chain reaction of quiet, calculated abandonment. No one dared openly confront China. But no one was willing to go down with it. The world was moving, and Beijing was left, increasingly, to dance alone. It wasn't just Southeast Asia pulling away. It was deeper. It was global. Even the alliances Xi Jinping had spent a decade carefully nurturing were starting to fracture. Take Russia. Officially, Moscow and Beijing are strategic partners without limits. The narrative, two authoritarian giants standing shoulder to shoulder against American dominance. But behind closed doors, cracks were widening. Just last week, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky broke his long silence. In multiple interviews, he directly accused China of fueling Russia's war machine. China, he said, was secretly supplying Russia with dual-use technologies, components that could be used for both civilian and military purposes, all while pretending to be a neutral peace broker. This wasn't random speculation. It was strategic exposure. Zelensky, facing brutal war, knew the price of letting China maintain its fake neutrality. He pulled the curtain back and forced Beijing into the spotlight it desperately wanted to avoid. China's foreign ministry snapped back as usual. Deny, deflect, accuse. But then came the twist. Russia's own state media, Sputnik News, broke the script. In a glowing article, they praised China for its contributions: electronic parts, industrial components, logistics support. They celebrated the unbreakable trust between Beijing and Moscow. On the surface, it looked like a compliment. But under the surface, it was a trap. In diplomatic language, it's called praise so loud it hurts. Russia wasn't just thanking China. They were exposing it, blowing Beijing's cover as a neutral player, forcing China into a corner where denial sounded hollow and credibility drained away. Even within China's tightly controlled social media, users couldn't hide their laughter. One viral comment summed it up. Xi played the double game. Putin played the double-double. Meanwhile, back in Southeast Asia, another symbolic betrayal unfolded. Cambodia, Beijing's so-called iron brother in ASEAN, had long been a poster child for Chinese influence. Billions poured into infrastructure, military bases, port developments. China thought it had bought loyalty. But loyalty, it turns out, has an expiration date. After Cambodia's GHIM naval base was renovated with Chinese funds, expectations were clear. No foreign militaries without Beijing's blessing. Yet barely 24 hours after Xi's departure, 2 Japanese warships docked at GHIM. A ceremony was held. Flags were raised. Photos circulated, Japanese sailors standing proudly on a Chinese renovated pier. For Beijing, it wasn't just a diplomatic slap. It was a message broadcast in high definition. You can build the ports. You can pay the bills. But you can't buy the soul of a nation forever. Even Singapore, always careful, always calculated, was sending unmistakable signals. When Ho Ching, with all her deep ties to China's elite, reposted a searing critique comparing Xi Jinping to a mob boss, it wasn't a random social media post. It was an insider's warning. A leak from the top echelons of Southeast Asia's financial political network. It said, without saying, "We see you. We don't trust you. And we're preparing for a world where China no longer calls the shots." The old alliances were splintering. Not with guns or battles, but with trade deals signed elsewhere. With semiconductor routes tightening. With military bases welcoming American and Japanese ships. Slowly, quietly, a new reality was taking shape. The Belt and Road was fraying. The strategic partnerships were hollowing out. The community of shared future was becoming a community of polite distance. And Xi Jinping, who once believed economic power guaranteed loyalty, was watching helplessly as the world recalibrated its bets. Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, even pieces of Africa and the Middle East. All were hedging. All were moving. Not because they hated China, but because they saw something worse. A partner trapped, a sinking ship, an empire slipping and unwilling to admit it. And no one, not even China's closest brothers, wanted to be dragged down with it. The cracks inside China's alliances were only the beginning. The real collapse, the one Beijing feared most, was rippling through the veins of global trade. It started small, barely noticeable. A few missing parts here, a delayed shipment there. But supply chains, like dominoes, don't collapse all at once. They fall in sequence, one hidden fault line triggering the next. And China's web of influence, built over 2 decades of rapid expansion, was unraveling faster than anyone predicted. The signs were everywhere. Vietnam, once heavily reliant on Chinese materials for assembly and re-export, began issuing strict directives against illegal transshipments. Inspectors flooded ports. Factories faced surprise audits. Anything smelling remotely like a Chinese workaround was flagged, delayed, or outright rejected. Thailand followed. The Director General of Foreign Trade announced 42 categories of goods. Aluminum films, electric bicycles, solar panels were found fraudulently claiming Thai origin. Most of these products, destined for the US and European markets. Every discovery tightened the noose. Certificates of origin became weapons. Port authorities became gatekeepers. Trade routes China once manipulated with ease now looked more like heavily policed minefields. Even Cambodia, despite billions in Chinese aid, began drafting new procedures to crack down on fraudulent exports. Everywhere, the pattern repeated. Customs inspections doubled. Penalties toughened. Cooperation with American and European trade agencies deepened. China's once dominant role as the silent supplier, slipping goods through friendly ports, was collapsing under its own weight. And the timing couldn't have been worse. Because while Southeast Asia was tightening its gates, the United States was opening new doors, but only for trusted partners. Under new trade frameworks, countries like Vietnam, India, and Indonesia were offered preferential market access in exchange for strict compliance on rules of origin. Play by the rules. Get rewarded. Play dirty. Get locked out. It was economic realignment through incentives, not sanctions. And it worked. One by one, nations that once turned a blind eye to China's tricks began choosing stability. Choosing Washington. Even in sectors China once dominated, like aviation, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Malaysia Aviation Group, sensing opportunity, negotiated to absorb canceled Boeing orders if Chinese airlines pulled out. A move that undercut Beijing's leverage and reinforced America's industrial revival. At the same time, Wall Street was pulling back. Investment banks, once eager to pour billions into China's manufacturing boom, were quietly diverting funds toward India, Vietnam, and Latin America. Risk models were updated. Supply chain diversification was no longer optional. It was survival. Every time a country tightened inspection rules, every time a company diversified sourcing, another domino fell. China's dominance wasn't shattered by a single blow. It was death by 1,000 cuts. And it wasn't just Southeast Asia moving. In Europe, regulators launched multiple investigations into origin fraud tied to Chinese goods. Germany, France, and the Netherlands began blacklisting companies suspected of transshipment manipulation. In Africa, countries courted by China's Belt and Road found themselves reassessing, wondering if tying themselves too closely to Beijing might trigger secondary sanctions from Washington. The global map was shifting, quietly, relentlessly. Xi Jinping had once dreamed of chaining the world to China's economic engine. Instead, he had triggered a chain reaction that was dismantling those chains link by link. And as each domino fell, the consequences multiplied. Delays in Chinese factories, shrinking profit margins for exporters, rising insurance premiums for goods suspected of fraud. The world wasn't cutting China off with declarations. It was bleeding Beijing dry with 1,000 silent exits. And perhaps the cruelest irony? China's own tactics, pressuring neighbors, cutting backdoor deals, using gray zone economic warfare, had taught the world exactly how to fight back. Not with missiles, not with embargoes, but with inspections, with documentation, with trust. Trust, once broken, doesn't scream. It simply disappears. And for China, the disappearance was accelerating. The dominoes were still falling. And Beijing, once the architect of global supply lines, was now trapped inside the very web it had spun. No way out, no safe exit, only an accelerating collapse. Silent, systematic, unstoppable. Collapse is rarely immediate. It begins with cracks. Silent, hidden. Then, when no one expects, it breaks wide open. For China, the cracks in its supply chains were only the first warning shots. The true disaster was deeper, more permanent. Isolation. And it was happening in plain sight. Step by step, the global trading system, once tightly interwoven with Chinese factories, was disentangling itself. And Beijing couldn't stop it. The old model was simple. China would flood the world with cheap goods. Countries would overlook human rights abuses, supply chain manipulation, currency games because profits flowed. But that model was dead. Slowly, methodically, a new economic Cold War was taking shape. Not a Cold War of armies. A Cold War of logistics. Of standards. Of access. United States led the charge. But it wasn't marching alone. In just the past 6 months, over 40 nations signed updated agreements to tighten rules of origin verification. 23 countries amended trade laws to block Chinese transshipments. Dozens of semiconductor manufacturers pledged to diversify away from Chinese inputs. Even traditional Chinese partners were shifting. Malaysia, once seen as a Belt and Road showcase, began quietly restructuring deals, inserting clauses that allowed exits if U.S. sanctions escalated. Thailand deepened military cooperation with Washington, linking trade deals to defense ties. Vietnam emerged as a strategic darling, a critical hub for American supply chain realignment. And the U.S. wasn't just playing defense. It was offering carrots, access to the American consumer market, investment into infrastructure, preferential technology transfer, for partners who cut dependency on China. The incentives worked. Nations that once balanced carefully between Beijing and Washington were now tilting, subtly but decisively, toward America. Meanwhile, China's countermoves rang hollow. Threats of retaliation, warnings of serious consequences, vows to punish trade partners who betrayed Beijing. But the world had learned something dangerous. China's threats worked when it was indispensable. Now, not anymore. And as dependence shrank, fear shrank too. Take Cambodia again. After hosting Japanese warships at a Chinese-built naval base, Phnom Penh didn't even bother issuing a formal apology to Beijing. Silence, more cutting than any excuse, signaled Cambodia's calculation. Better to hedge now than sink later. Even in Europe, where Beijing once thought it had soft power leverage, things were shifting. Germany, long a pillar of Chinese trade ties, announced new scrutiny on Chinese mergers and acquisitions. France floated proposals to screen outbound investments for national security risks, aimed squarely at curbing Chinese influence. And then came the financial blow. Wall Street, once China's eager banker, started pulling back. Not loudly, not with press releases, just quietly redirecting capital, repricing risk, treating Chinese exposure as a liability, not an asset. Money flows where trust goes. And trust was bleeding out of Beijing faster than any policy could patch it. Inside China, whispers grew louder. Manufacturers in Guangdong, exporters in Fujian, tech suppliers in Shenzhen, all reporting the same symptoms: orders drying up, insurance premiums rising, trade finance harder to secure, clients asking for relocation assurances. Clients weren't canceling contracts overnight. They were simply refusing to renew them. One by one cycle at a time, China's dominance was eroding from within. This wasn't a sanctions blitz. This wasn't a naval blockade. This was death by irrelevance. A superpower being slowly frozen out without a single shot fired. And Beijing knew it. That's why China's Ministry of Commerce, usually cautious with language, issued a rare, desperate statement. Nations that align with hostile trade practices will face reciprocal and firm measures. Translation: panic. Even longtime allies, Brazil, South Africa, even parts of the Middle East, started hedging, seeking reassurances from Washington before finalizing major deals with Chinese firms. No one wanted to bet against China, but no one wanted to bet only on China either. The world was moving into blocks, supply chains reordering, technology fences rising, financial alliances redrawn, a new economic Cold War already underway. And for the first time in decades, China wasn't leading. It wasn't dictating. It was being dictated to. Trapped between collapsing supply lines and evaporating alliances, China found itself facing a reality it never prepared for, a world willing to survive without it. And survival without power is the cruelest exile of all. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It was relentless. Red carpets could not mask it. Diplomatic ceremonies could not reverse it. Supply chains broke. Alliances fractured. Trust disappeared. And now China stands not at the center of a new global order, but outside it, knocking on doors that no longer open. Xi Jinping once dreamed of reshaping the world around China. Instead, the world is reshaping itself without him. The question isn't whether China can survive this new economic Cold War. The real question is, can Beijing ever rebuild the trust it so casually destroyed, before the walls close in for good? What happens next may not just decide China's fate. It may redraw the map of global power for decades to come. Tell me, is the Cold War already lost for Beijing? Or is the real battle just beginning?